Well, good bright and early morning from Gdańsk, the absolutely picturesque city here along the Baltic Sea in the north of Poland. Now, this is a city that has immense significance for the events of the 20th century. After all, it's more or less where World War II began in September of 1939. And it's also the place that gave birth to the Solidarity trade union movement in 1980, a union which went on to basically precipitate what they call the fall of communism. Well, walking around here in Gdańsk, the first thing you notice is that there's a lot of tourists in town for sure. It is mid-August, so still that summer season. But of course, the vast majority of people you hear speaking Polish. After all, we are in Poland. But for a long period of time, this was really a predominantly German city. For huge periods, it was actually part of the Kingdom of Prussia, and then later on the German Empire. And in the German language, Gdańsk is known as Danzig. Now, basically with the events of World War I and the conclusion of that war, Germany comes out on the losing side. And what happens is in 1920, well, Danzig becomes a city under the auspices of the League of Nations. So from this point forward until 1939, it was known as the Free City of Danzig. Well, when Danzig was a free city, this was its flag, when it was a de facto state, and it remains the flag of Gdańsk today. So even though Danzig was a free city during the interwar period, its population was still overwhelmingly German. In fact, by the outbreak of World War II, it was said that perhaps 95% of the city's inhabitants were German-speaking, and at least two-thirds, if not 80 or 85%, were actually ethnic Germans. So this led to a situation where already from 1920, there was a growing movement for Danzig to once again become part of Germany proper. And then, with the rise of the Nazi Party, actually by the late 1930s, overwhelmingly the city's administration was pro-Nazi, if not outright members of the Nazi Party. Well, here in the old town of Gdańsk, you can tell that a lot of the buildings are new, the vast majority, in fact, because the city would have suffered immense damage during World War II. On the 1st of September of 1939, that's when World War II really began, with Germany attacking Polish positions here in Gdańsk. There was a German warship called Schleswig-Holstein, which attacked an outpost known as Westerplatte. Actually, at Westerplatte right now, they're building a museum dedicated to this, which is supposed to open in 2026, so we'll have to come back next year to check that out if they get it done on time. But anyway, the Polish forces put up very stiff resistance, which lasted for about a week, but in the end, the Germans overran them completely. Sunday morning in Gdańsk. It's around 9 o'clock and eerily quiet, but yesterday I came in around 8 p.m. and it was live. I mean, Saturday night here. And as it became clear that Germany was going to decisively lose World War II, a lot of the German residents here in Danzig began to leave. And a lot of them actually ended up drowning in the Baltic Sea after escapes had gone terribly wrong. Now, by November of 1945, 6 months after the end of the war, it was said that around 93,000 ethnic Germans remained here in Danzig. But from this point forward, the population transfers would ensue. And to me, that's one of the most mind-blowing elements of what you have here today in Gdańsk. You have a completely, more or less, Polish city, whereas back in the period 80 years ago, you had a almost homogeneous German city. It's just really striking to me how in those few years after the end of World War II, so many so-called population transfers were taking place. And let's use a less politically correct word. Let's call them expulsions. And that was taking place not only here in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Palestine, of course, the events of 1947, 1948, and also 1947 with the partition in India, which gave rise to the birth of Pakistan. Well, something to mark more recent history, and by more recent I mean only 6 years ago, this is the spot where the mayor of Gdańsk, Paweł Adamowicz, would have been brutally murdered just after giving a speech. I mean, the architecture is definitely unique, no question about that. I mean, you ever seen a Hilton hotel that looks like this? So, you know, yesterday I took the bus here from Kaunas, which took around 9 hours. But looking at the map, it looks like it would have taken less time if we would have taken a more direct route through Kaliningrad. But of course, with the political situation nowadays, that's all but impossible. So yeah, also fascinating to think about how Kaliningrad, which is so close yet so far in a sense, is now a Russian city, but back in the day was known as Königsberg, also part of East Prussia and Germany. So I've just got one full day here in Gdańsk, so I have to make the most of it. And we're going to be visiting two museums. And here's the first. It's known simply as the Museum of the Second World War, opened in 2017. Pretty impressive from the outside. Let's see what the inside is like. Yeah, there's a big line here on this Sunday afternoon. It took me about half an hour just to buy my ticket. I was actually a little bit afraid that I wasn't going to be able to get a slot. But we're in there. We just have to wait another 13 minutes until 12 noon. Well, finally in. I don't think I've seen this many people queuing for a museum in a long period of time, but actually on the inside it's not really all that busy yet. Well, in terms of the contents of the museum, it's more or less what you would anticipate from an institution like this in Poland. And I say that because it really does two things. Number one, it aims to hold Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union equally responsible for starting World War II. In addition to this, it paints both countries as having effectively twin dictatorships. Now, I think there are some significant problems with that. I mean, yeah, there were undoubtedly excesses and crimes that were committed during the Stalin period in the USSR. But in terms of their economic and social systems, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were not only fundamentally different, but really diametrically opposed. I mean, thus why Hitler was initially met with so much enthusiasm by many Western leaders, including Winston Churchill. It also doesn't provide much needed context of how the Soviets had attempted to form a military alliance with Britain and France in 1938, only to be rebuked, paving the way for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a sort of last resort. But I can understand why many Poles would have a degree of disdain for the Soviet Union, especially during this period, considering the annexation of vast parts of its territory that would then be transferred to Belarus and Ukraine, as well as the mass deportations that ensued. But we also have to remember that Polish troops formed part of the Red Army that marched their way into Berlin in the spring of 1945, and the Poland's flag would be hoisted in the city upon its liberation. Well, stumbled into a protest here in Gdańsk, people calling for weapons for Ukraine. So a piece of the Berlin Wall sits here in Gdańsk, right next to the headquarters of Solidarity, and a piece of the wall from the Lenin shipyard, as far as I know. Alright, so our second and final museum of the day is going to be the European Solidarity Center, opened in 2014, and it tells the story of the Solidarity trade union movement. Let's see if this one moves me more than the last one. So here at the gates of the European Solidarity Center, you have a memorial to the fallen shipyard workers of 1970. So a full decade before Solidarity was even founded, you had another strike which happened here in Gdańsk and reverberated across Poland. And this was on the back of price hikes, which is very similar to the story of 1980. You know, just to think about the fact that we are standing in what was known once upon a time as the Lenin shipyard. And yeah, what would Lenin himself have thought about the government in Poland at the time, and also the government in the Soviet Union and across the Eastern Bloc countries? And what would his view be of Solidarity, for example? Well, it was in this very hall where Solidarity was created in August of 1980, and within a year it already had 10 million members across Poland. After World War II, Poland was reorganized as a People's Republic, a state that was under the leadership of the Polish United Workers' Party, and nominally socialist. But from the beginning, there were cleavages between the working masses themselves and their government. In 1956 and 1970, strikes broke out which were then put down by the authorities. In 1980, the Solidarity Trade Union was born out of the Lenin shipyard. Its strength led to it being recognized by the Polish government as an independent trade union, the first of its kind in the countries of the Warsaw Pact. However, within a year, Poland was under martial law. Even through this period, Solidarity continued to organize acts of resistance, and eventually in 1989, roundtable talks led to elections being organized, which were in turn won by a coalition led by the union. And in today's Poland, the Solidarity Trade Union, it still exists, although you could say it's really a shell of its former self. And already from the early 1990s, with the so-called transition to democracy, its leader Lech Wałęsa becomes president, and he oversees the mass privatization of Poland's economy, which, as you can imagine, did not go down well with a lot of unionists. You know, for me, one thing that always comes to mind when I think of solidarity is the fact that in the 1980s, it was receiving significant support from not just Western governments, but also Western governments who were incredibly anti-union at home. For example, think about Ronald Reagan, think about Margaret Thatcher, their facilitation of neoliberalism. And yet these were the ones who said that they supported unions and workers in Poland. I mean, come on, man. Well, you know, if there's one theme that seems to be evident from both museums I visited today, it's that we've reached the end of history, more or less. You know, that nowadays we have freedom and democracy, and on that basis, mission accomplished. And I would say that a lot of people don't see it this way, not only here in Poland, but across much of the world. I mean, I think that the need for a more fair distribution of resources, of wealth, is more obvious than ever, and we've reached a tipping point. And that tipping point brings us to an old conclusion: either socialism or barbarism. But this time around, any sort of socialism that we achieve has to be profoundly democratic from the get-go. I mean, I believe very strongly in the old adage, no socialism without democracy, no meaningful democracy without socialism.